everybody, I'm Jane Sawyer, and this is Jane Sawyer Makes a Creepy Cupid. Hey, so my birthday is coming up on the 14th of February, and despite having my birthday be on Valentine's Day for as long as I can remember anyways, I have never actually done a Valentine's Day project. I've built projects for lots of other holidays, but never actually Valentine's Day. So this year I want to build a creepy Cupid project. So I want to show you what I have sketched up and bring you along for the build. Okay, so this is what I'm thinking for the head. I want him to have sort of a very youthful cherub look to him, but then I want to give him a very menacing, gross, evil smile. So I'm thinking a cross between like Chucky from Child's Play and Pennywise. And then compositionally, I want him to be in flight, drawing back his arrow, and I want to do some bat wings, and I would really, really like to try making his wings flap. So I want to try to do some automation here if I can rig it up. Okay, so I think first thing I want to do is find like a baby doll or something from the thrift store, and that'll just help me keep the proportions correct, and you know, why reinvent the wheel, right? So first thing to do is head to the thrift store.
Okay, on one hand there's this guy, and he already looks kind of evil, but his body is really squishy and rubbery, so I'm not too sure. And then my other option would be this guy. He's good and firm, and so I think this would be a good one to sculpt on top of, but I do love the evil looking face of this guy.
Okay, this is the baby I came home with. I'm gonna take him apart now. I need to remove his head. I feel kind of bad about doing this, which is probably silly, but here we go.
I got a heat gun to warm up the plastic doll joints before I ripped them apart. I wrestled the head off and oops, surprise, there's a tube in there. I think this baby used to tinkle. Anyhow, I removed his arms and his legs, and then I got to work on the head.
It's surgery time.
I used masking tape to mark guidelines, and then I just carefully cut off the back portion of his head so I could get inside to rip out his eyeballs. I'm definitely going to save these for another project. They are super cool. I tape them back together and put some tape over his eye sockets, and then I'm going to use some plasticine modeling clay to bulk up the front of his face. I want this area to be larger on my final sculpture. You have to use an oil-based clay here. Play-Doh won't work. It'll just make a mess. Now I'm using some thin brown packing paper that comes in shipping boxes and a 1-to-1 mix of glue and water, and I'm applying 5 layers of paper mache. I don't let these layers dry in between. I apply them wet on wet, and it doesn't take very long. When those layers are all dry, I'm going to draw a line and cut the doll parts out of the paper mache. I can use this doll for another project, and the plastic bits are just going to be in my way later if I leave them in there. The paper mache pops off pretty easily. There's a little bit of wrestling involved, but it's not too much trouble, and man, is it satisfying when it comes off. I use a small glue gun to reattach the 2 halves of my forms, and then I'm going to paper mache over the seams and let that dry, so I have one head and one potato-looking torso. There's a bunch of different ways to make eyes, but for this project I found a free printable for some irises. I printed those out onto photo paper and cut them into strips, and then I used this little circle punch to cut around the irises. I cleaned and applied resin to some glass cabochons and cured them under a UV lamp. Now I have some pretty good looking custom glass eyeballs. I set the eyes aside for a little bit and cut off the lower portion of the paper mache head to make a jaw. I made some polymer clay teeth off camera. You could easily use air dry clay if you wanted to here. I hot glued the teeth into the top and the bottom jaws. I also cut eye sockets and dry fit my glass eyes, and hot dang, that is already looking creepy. Now I'm going to paper mache around the little teeth to make some gums. I always do this with colored paper because I hate painting around little teeth. In this case, the red construction paper I had just wasn't red enough, so I'm giving it an acrylic wash. Construction paper can be kind of hard to work with when you're talking paper mache, so I usually crunch it up and then flatten it and scrunch it up again a few times to make it softer. Then I rip it into small strips, and then it's just a matter of working the strips in between the teeth, wrapping one strip over the base of each side of the tooth. This is probably the most tedious bit of papering I'll do on this project, but it saves me tons of tedious painting later, so I think it's well worth it. Initially, I had made a form for his tongue out of paper towel, and then when I went to cover it in paper clay, it turned into a mushy disaster as soon as the paper towel got damp again. So I went back and made the tongue armature out of tinfoil like I should have done in the first place. I covered the tinfoil in paper clay and then really focused on smoothing out the tongue to make it look slippery and gross. When the tongue and jaws were all dry, the tongue got a coat of red paint and I painted inside the head and the jaw with black. I was unfortunately out of frame when I glued the tongue in, but you can kind of see in this shot the tongue is sitting in a pool of hot glue at the back of his head. I positioned and reattached his jaw, used some tinfoil to make a little chin, and then I decided I needed a little bit more neck to work with, so I shoved a toilet paper roll up into his head hole and smoothed everything back down with some more paper mache. This is how we're going to leave him to dry until the next stage of assembly, and already with those teeth and that tongue, I think he's looking really freaking creepy. I handled the legs in a very similar way to the head and torso. I covered them in paper mache, but I kind of got over anxious here and I tried to get away with only 2 layers of paper. This did not work. You can see I am struggling to get the paper off the legs. They are not staying together very well, and I had to go back and do a bunch of repair work with extra layers of paper. Ultimately, I didn't want his feet sticking out the way they were. I wanted him with more relaxed, pointed toes. I cut the feet off at the ankle. Then I used some pieces of cereal box as filler pieces so I could get the foot position I was going for. Then I brought in the old torso potato and glued his little legs on there. This then got papered over and set aside to dry. These are the arms that came with my doll, and they were too short and chubby for me, so I decided to build a new set. This foam came wrapped around the legs of a chair I bought recently. I cut the foam into some ovals and cut some wire for my arm armatures. I sandwiched the wire between layers of foam with hot glue that was far too hot to be using with foam, but what can you do? I trimmed off the excess wire, then used some softer, finer wire to make fingers. I paper over all that in the normal way until I get to the fingers. To cover the fingers, I just very loosely crumple and wrap around my little wires. I'm going to want to bend and break the fingers later, so I'm just trying to provide bulk to the fingers with this pass, not make the paper mache super smooth and strong. Here you can see my dry paper mache arms compared to the original doll arms. The new arms are just going to be easier for me to bend into position to make it look like Cupid is firing his bow. Speaking of bows, it was at this point I realized where I couldn't really finalize the grip position of his hands without having his bow and arrow, so I needed to build these next. I spent too much time carving a riser for his bow out of foam core, which I covered in paper clay. The limbs of the bow are made with craft sticks. I used boiling water to get them to bend this way. I made a wee arrowhead out of polymer clay, then jumped into a snowy ditch to grab a cattail stem for an arrow shaft. With these items built, I could revisit the hands. I used the internal wires and broke and bent the papered fingers into position, dry, fitting his grip around his little accessories. Then, just thinking ahead a little bit, I went ahead and did a skim coat of paper clay over his hands while I could still flip his arms around and get in between his little fingies easily. Here's his arms, bow and arrow, all cleaned up and dry.
Now that I've got sort of the head and torso figured out, I need to figure out what I'm going to do for the wing. Never done this before, but I think I'm going to build a wire frame and then try to cover them with something translucent. So let's put together some wire frames.
I started with a rough sketch of a wing frame taped underneath my work mat. I cut and bent wire to follow the lines of my sketch, taping things down as I went to keep things flat and orderly. I was sure to include a little hinge because remember, we're going to make these wings flap. I'll give you a better view of how I made that hinge. It's a great little trick to know. You start with 2 bits of wire and something firm that is slightly thicker than your wire. In this case, I'm using a toothpick. You're going to bend one wire into an L shape, and then you're going to take your other wire and wrap it in a tight coil around the toothpick. Wrestle out your toothpick, slide your coil onto your L, and then bend the top of the L over. And there you have a nice little hinge. I used this same trick when I built my wing frames. I just incorporated the hinge bit into the frame itself. With the wires all laid out, I used some 5-minute epoxy and a toothpick to dab on each intersection. While the epoxy dried, I tested out some options for covering the wire frames, which all ended up looking like hot garbage. So I picked up some purple tissue paper and some matte Mod Podge. Believe it or not, I haven't used Mod Podge since about grade 3 when decoupage was really poppin'. But oh man, did the smell of this stuff ever take me back to crafting in my parents' basement while watching Saved by the Bell.
I'm so excited!
I used paper clay to give some meat to the top of the wings. When that was dry, I painted the meaty bit black. Here are the wings at the end of this stage. I didn't really achieve the translucency I was hoping for, but they're lightweight and sturdy and they look pretty cool, so good enough.
Now that I have all of Cupid's component parts finally built, I can get to putting them together. Maybe I'll do it in a montage.
I apparently don't have any footage of this, but at some point I shoved these 2 support dowels into his belly. These dowels will go into a basin, hold him up so he can fly. It's hard to tell on camera, but he was really front heavy at this point. I wanted him to be a bit better balanced so he can live a more stable life, so I used the hollow cavities in his legs to my advantage. I drilled a couple of holes and did a very messy job of pouring in some sandblasting sand. After this little operation, he's left a lot more evenly balanced. I don't know if you can tell from the footage, but trust me, I was super smart for doing this. I attached him temporarily to a strip of melamine. This was just to make it easier to hold while I worked on him. I hot glued his eyeballs onto his head, rendering the holes I'd cut earlier completely useless. I made him a little tinfoil nose and then I started covering him in paper clay. This is a laborious process, but it's really fun to take your time and give your character a lot of personality. I was using marble, Greek, and Roman statues as my inspiration for the forms, but trying to put an animated, creepy spin on it. Cupid is supposedly the Roman god of love, so I thought I'd draw from some classic imagery in that regard. I let the paper clay dry really well, like for 2 days, and then I sanded him smooth off camera. All right, let's give our boy some paint. Working directly on the paper clay, I base coated him in bright pink from the top and dark blue from the bottom. Next, I used dry brushing techniques to slowly build up to his final color. The bold base colors will shine through all the layers of dry brushing, and I really love the depth I can achieve with this type of finish. Again, I was thinking about Roman marble statues, so I was aiming for an amped up, illustrative, but creepy marble look. I added a bit of variety to the surface with some veins and splatters, but my favorite little kiss of magic is using this translucent bright yellow as a highlight. I think it makes him glow and it looks out of this world. I had bought this dragonfly glaze for a different project, but never tried it, so I threw some on his wings. Turns out this stuff is really cool. It's very smooth and thick, and it has a high payoff. I like how it shimmers, but it doesn't look like glitter. Before I moved on, I knocked back some of the veining and spattering I'd done by dabbing at them with a bit of translucent white paint on a makeup sponge. Behind the scenes of this whole sculpting process, I've been working on making parts and figuring out how to make his wings flap. This is not something I'm an expert in, but I've been reading a lot lately about the folk art of making whirligigs or automata. These arts use simple mechanical parts cut from wood that create motion. In real life, I struggled through this, a lot more than I'll show here, but I thought it was worth mentioning that I learned a lot and failed my way to success on this one. Here's what I came up with. I cut and assembled this pine box that will be the stand for the sculpture and also house the mechanics. This little crank will turn an axle that runs through the box. The axle runs through a snug off-center hole in each of these 2 circles of wood. The circles are called cams. I glued together a few washers to provide some weight to this shoe or follower that supports a rod that goes up through the top of the box. The followers sit on top of each cam, so when I turn the crank, the cams bump the followers up and down. From the followers, the rods go up through the top of the box to the base of Cupid's wings. The top of the rods are pinned to the base of the wings. Now, when I turn the crank, the rod pushes the wings up and down and it looks like he's flying. I love how low-tech and tactile this is. It feels kind of magical in its simplicity. Before we get to the final beauty shots of this project, the last thing I always do when I make this type of monster is to add some drool. This is 5-minute epoxy from the dollar store. I mix up my epoxy and apply to his mouth with a toothpick. I fiddle with it as it sets, trying to get these drips to form right as the epoxy sets.
And that's a wrap on Cupid, my friends. Give me a like if you think I did a good job, and make sure you're subscribed if you want to see what I get up to next. I'm going to be posting new videos here as often as I can. You can follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and Pinterest. I'm Jane Sawyer and Makes on all platforms. Thanks so much for watching, friends. On to the beauty shots.